Thank you for joining us today. Please note that there is no CPE attached to this webinar. Please view our upcoming events and webinars at cbh.com for CPE opportunities. Our presentation will begin in a moment.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Cherry Bekaert's webinar on After the Shutdown, Now What? My name is Eric Toppy. I'm a Senior Manager in the Government Contract Services Group, and today we're going to be covering a number of items related to the shutdown. I do have to have a quick caveat. This is not meant to be legal advice, but to better position you as a contractor to the government to know what your options are. You know, we're about 10 days into this continuing resolution from the shutdown. We are hoping that another shutdown is not going to happen, but we really wanted to communicate to everyone what are the potential options as a contractor to potentially seek maybe a claim or reimbursement, or really just what is on the table for you. I'm also joined here by Susan Moser, a partner who started the Government Contract Services Group here at Cherry Bekaert, and John Ford, who is senior consultant in our team. Formerly, John was Deputy General Counsel for DCAA and has served various roles at the government. And myself, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a senior manager on our team, and I will be moderating this presentation. So as an overview, we're going to give a quick introduction, of what's been currently going on. We're going to dive into some of the contract clauses that might be incorporated into your contracts, depending on what type of work it is, where we'll be discussing excusable delays, compensable delays, changes, inspections, and payments. And then we'll slow down a little bit and talk about some protests and claims and appeals, and talk about really, what are the next steps. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan now, who's going to give us a brief introduction of what's currently going on.
So thanks, Eric. So as Eric mentioned, really our presentation today is really meant to be some general guidance to give you an idea on what are some of your rights, and it's not intended to be a substitute for individual accounting or legal advice. Your specific rights and obligations following the government shutdown really vary depending on several factors. One, customers, obviously not every agency, thankfully, was impacted by the shutdown, although there were certainly enough. So for some companies, and certainly with some clients that we deal with, they had little or no impact. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case for a lot of other clients that do work for the various agencies impacted. Obviously, some people are having more significant impacts than others. So the customers that you do business with certainly has an impact. The types of contracts that you have a factor in terms of what potential rights and obligations you have, whether you have a cost reimbursement, fixed price, and then what clauses are in your contract. And so John's going to talk specifically about a couple of clauses, and the types of work that you do certainly impacts this. So unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember, and John Ford is, Eric is probably not, when we had another shutdown back in the 90s. I remember I was a CFO for a government contract at the time, and we had quite a number of impacts. Back then, Congress did come to the rescue, so to speak, for the contract community. I think our general message is we don't think anyone should count on that happening this time. And so, without some congressional action, which again, who knows, but we don't think that you should plan on that. Then your best bet is to know your contracts, know your rights, and seek any potential redress opportunities that you have under the terms of your contract. The most important thing to remember is that while the government often tries to force you to bear the brunt of any impacts of the shutdown and insists that you pick up the performance right where you left off, there are at least 4 sets of clauses that do require the government to provide you with additional time and additional money, and to the extent that a schedule has been delayed or that you're forced to incur costs, whether those are direct or indirect related to the shutdown, you do have some relief. So John is going to talk about some of these clauses Then we will cover a number of other areas in addition to the clauses, but other potential impacts, whether that's as it relates to proposals or claims you may have filed, protests. We'll also talk a little bit about late invoice payments, and then really most importantly, documentation and what are the next steps. So with that, I will turn it over to John to talk about some of the things that you should be checking for in your contracts.
Thank you, Susan. One of the first things everybody should be recognizing is, as a result of the shutdown, is where they have been delayed in performing the contract. Delays caused by the shutdown can be what we call an excusable delay. By definition, an excusable delay is one that arises from causes beyond the control and without the fault or neglect of the contractor. Government shutdowns would clearly fall within that definition. And there are various clauses in the FAR that are included in various types of contracts that address excusable delays. And we identified those clauses here, which cover a broad spectrum of contract types. You'll notice even contracts for commercial items. So we have contracts for commercial items, cost reimbursement, fixed price, and construction contracts are all covered by excusable delay provisions. And the key thing about an excusable delay is that generally the contractor is entitled to a schedule adjustment to reflect the impact of that excusable delay on the contractor's ability to complete the contract. And depending on the circumstances, that schedule adjustment may be the same as, shorter than, or same as the period of delay, shorter than the period of delay, or actually longer than the period of delay. So you have to look at what was the impact of the excusable delay on your ability to complete the contract. The bad thing about an excusable delay is you don't get money for under these clauses. That's why they're called non-compensable delays. The good thing is that if you experience an excusable delay, the government cannot terminate you for default, for failure to perform. Also, the government cannot assess liquidated damages against you if you're late in performing due to an excusable delay. As I mentioned, if you have an excusable delay, you're generally entitled to a schedule extension. If the government insists on adherence, that is, you sticking to the original schedule or speeding up performance, this insistence by the government could very well be a type of constructive change known as a constructive acceleration to the contract, which is considered to be a type of a constructive change for which you are entitled to an equitable adjustment to the contract. So if you receive such an order from the government, keep records of what you must, any cost that you incur as a result of accelerating performance under the contract. Now, the elements to recognize whether you have constructive acceleration, the elements of a constructive acceleration are an excusable delay, government knowledge of the excusable delay in order to accelerate performance and increase cost to the contractor caused by the order to accelerate. So if these factors are present in your situation, don't be hesitant to be considering an equitable adjustment in addition to which would include a schedule extension.
And John, I'm going to jump in real quick. I think you hit it on the last slide. If you think that there's an acceleration and you think that you might have an REA situation, start the record retention as soon as possible when you have that first inkling. We're going to get into this a little bit more, but I just wanted to call that out, that if this does pop up, or you do believe it, start collecting the documents that you think would be necessary to help with that claim. Start interrupting.
Right, including what constitutes the order to accelerate. That is a key factor.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the There is a possible monetary relief that can come from a delay, and that is recovery of unabsorbed overhead under the Eichley formula. Generally, contractors are entitled to receive unabsorbed overhead if the government and the government alone caused a delay of indeterminate time. That is, there was no specified time period for the delay, such as the shutdown. We never knew when it was going to end. The contractor was required to be on standby to resume work during the period of delay. Again, during the shutdown, contractors were generally sitting there leaning forward, ready to charge off the starting blocks once the delay ended, and it would be impractical, say, to demobilize your workforce while you're waiting for this indeterminate period of delay to end. And also, the third factor for Eichley relief is that it was impractical for the contractor to take on replacement work during the delay. That doesn't mean the contractor couldn't take on any new work, but this deals with replacement work, that is, to work to replace the income lost by contracts that were suspended or on which work could not be done during the shutdown.
And John, one of the things we're going to talk a little bit about documentation and gathering information at the end of the presentation. We're not going to go through any more detail about the calculation and how do you calculate and determine unabsorbed overhead during this webinar. It's just sort of beyond the scope. That said, it is very likely that there are contractors that will certainly have contracts that fall under this situation and will be entitled to this. So if you think that this applies to your contract, you definitely want to look into it. Again, we're not going to cover it on a webinar because it's too technical, but we'd be happy to talk with you about the mechanics of how that works separately.
Correct. Okay. In addition to the non-compensable delay clauses, there are various standard FAR clauses that are known as compensable delay clauses. And there are three of these clauses that are contained in the FAR. Suspension of work clause, which goes into construction contracts, the stop work order clause, and the government delay of work clauses. And as you see, I've given the clause numbers for those. Under these clauses, you're generally entitled to an extension of time and also monetary relief. That is, you get money, a price adjustment, for any delays or disruptions that were caused by actions of the government acting in its contractual capacity, which means you had to receive something, or the government contracting officer had to do something that caused you to be delayed in order for these clauses to apply. Under the excusable delays provision, it was not necessary for the contracting officer to do something, because the excusable delays provision applies to delays that were caused by the government acting in either its sovereign or contractual capacity. So the fact that you were delayed by the shutdown is enough for the excusable delays provision, but the contracting officer had to do something for these compensable delays provisions to apply. In order to reply, the stop work order clause applies only to ordered suspensions. That is, the contracting officer had to direct you to stop. The delay of work clause relates to constructive suspensions, and the suspension of work clause deals with both constructive and ordered suspensions. Now, the relief you get under the various clauses, that under the suspension of work clause, the contractor gets a price adjustment, but no profit or schedule adjustment. So you get just a price adjustment, which does not include profit or schedule, so don't confuse that with an equitable adjustment. Equitable adjustment is a term of art which would include profit, fee, or schedule. Under the government delay of work clause, the contractor is entitled to a price adjustment plus a schedule adjustment, but no profit. So again, just the price adjustment from a monetary position. Under the stop work order clause, the contractor is entitled to an equitable adjustment if the stop work order causes an increase in the costs or the time needed to complete the contract. So this equitable adjustment would include fee or profit in the adjustment made to the contract. As we alluded to earlier, each of these clauses has a time period within which to request an adjustment under the clause. So be careful and be aware of those time periods. However, they all have an out where there may be some exceptions. So be careful or be aware of the potential exceptions to the time periods. And later on we'll advise you about contacting legal counsel, and that would be a good advice to see if there are any exceptions to the time periods listed in these clauses.
And John, I know just in talking with a lot of our clients, a lot of our clients are going to have a combination. They received under some contracts a stop work order notice, and under other contracts they did not receive a stop work order, but they were delayed or suspended from being able to work because they needed to go to a facility that was closed, or they couldn't access the people that they interacted with were not available. And so it's very likely for a lot of companies you're going to have a combination. And again, what you're entitled to and the process is going to be different. So it is important to understand the distinctions and which is going to apply to each individual contract.
Right. That's why we said in the introduction, your rights and obligations depend on the clauses that are in your contract and the basis for any suspensions or delays in work that were caused by the shutdown. Was it just the fact that the shutdown occurred, or did the contracting officer direct you to stop work and give you specific directions as to what you were supposed to be doing during the shutdown? Also, there may be some cases where you were required to work even though the government was shut down and nobody was there to provide payment for you, supervision, or inspection of your work. So you may have been having to work, but without pay, which raises another interesting issue. Now, in addition to the compensable delays clauses, the changes clauses can be applicable to the shutdown. There are various changes clauses in the FAR that are used for various types of contracts, and we've numbers there. Under these changes clause, you're entitled to an equitable adjustment if a change is made to the contract that causes you to incur increased cost or additional time to perform the contract. So again, as we mentioned, equitable adjustment does include profit or fee. So that would be a benefit to you if you can assert a claim for request for an adjustment under the changes clause instead of under the delay of work clause or the suspension of work clause. Now, the changes clauses can come into play in one of three different ways. That is, the government orders a change or does something that changes your existing obligations under your contracts or requires more time or money to complete. So the government, pure delay has not been considered compensable under the changes clause. So the government must have done something else to cause you to have increased costs other than just pure delay.
So, John, just to jump in real quick, if the government wants to stick to your original schedule, even though they've had this month shutdown, that would not play into or fall under the changes clause, correct?
No, it
So
would. It would be
so
considered. It would be a constructive change. That's number 2 here. It would be a constructive change, such as constructive acceleration. Okay, so a change, for example, a change where the changes clause could come into play. The government recognizes, all right, you've had an excusable delay, and we're going to extend your contract through a modification issued under the changes clause. So if the time extension is issued under the changes clause instead of one of the excusable delays provisions, then you would be entitled to file your equitable adjustment, because the modification is under the changes clause, which provides for an equitable adjustment. So you have to look at government action that changes your obligations under the contract to be an ordered change, a constructive change, such as a constructive acceleration, or a cardinal change. And we're going to talk about cardinal changes a little bit later in regard to exercise of options, which are a complicated issue. All right, each changes clause has specific time periods within which you have to file your request for the equitable adjustment. However, each changes clause gives the government discretion to accept an REA that's submitted prior to final payment on a contract. And final payment means when all claims have been resolved and paid. So not just when the contract value has been paid. And so a failure by the government to accept an REA that is filed before final payment likely will be determined to be an abuse of discretion on the part of the government, unless the government can show that the delay by the contractor in submitting the REA prejudiced the government in some way, such as making it impossible for the government to defend against the REA. Although it would be very unlikely that a change brought about by the delay may be a deductive change, such changes can take place. That is, the government, as a result of the delay, may decide to delete some work from the contract. If doing so reduces the contractor's cost of performance, then the government is entitled to a deductive change to the contract. And remember, the REA under the changes clause covers the total impact of the change, not just cost impact or schedule impact on work that was changed under the clause. So you've got to consider ripple effect from a change when you're doing your REA. Now, I mentioned earlier about cardinal changes and options. So let's go through a little bit about the law of options, particularly if the notice of intent to exercise an option was due during the shutdown, or the option needed to be exercised during the shutdown. Under the law of options, the options need to be exercised in strict compliance with the terms of the option. So if the contract says notice has to be received or given to the contractor by a certain time, that means the contractor must generally receive that notice by that time. If the notice of intent to exercise the option is not received by the time specified in the contract, the exercise of any option following that would be improper. Similarly, most option clauses give a time frame within which the option must be exercised. If the option is not exercised by the time specified in the contract, any attempted exercise of that option or late exercise of the option is improper and would be a breach of the contract. So that means that the contractor does not have an obligation to perform an option that has not been exercised in strict compliance with the terms of the contract. However, the contractor can waive the breach and continue to perform. But this is where things get tricky. If the contractor performs without objection to the late exercise of the option, the contractor may have waived its right to any other relief under the contract. However, if the contractor performs after objection, that performance may be treated as a cardinal change to the contract, which would entitle the contractor to an equitable adjustment. These are general rules, and you should not operate on this discussion in this webinar without first consulting with competent government contract counsel as to what your rights are in regard to any option that was not exercised during the shutdown period. We do not want to encourage you to get into a default situation. So this is one area where caution has to be observed, and you should not act without consulting with counsel and getting advice in regard to your specific circumstances.
Good point.
All right, the inspection clauses. There could be some times during the shutdown that you had performed services which needed to be inspected, or supplies that were delivered or tendered to the government but were not inspected and accepted or rejected during the shutdown. This again raises some interesting issues. There is something in government contracts known as a constructive acceptance of work. That is, if the government waits too long to inspect work, so that when the government gets around to inspecting the work, it's impossible to tell if the work met contract specifications when submitted or performed, then the risk of non-compliance is on the government. So if the government has waited too long to do a rejection or acceptance of work, formal acceptance, it may be that the government has constructively accepted the supplies or services. If the government comes back after the shutdown and the facts indicate that a constructive acceptance has occurred, if the government wants you to do a correction, replacement, or reperformance of the services, you may be entitled to an equitable adjustment to the contract based on that constructive acceptance. Again, depending on what the terms are in your contract and the nature of the contract, fixed price or cost reimbursement, T&M. So you have to be very careful about that. In any event, if the government wants you to do a recorrection or replacement of work that was done under cost reimbursement contracts, you have you're entitled to be paid for the cost of doing that reperformance, but maybe not collect any fee on that reperformance. And similarly, under T&M contracts, if you have to correct work that was previously submitted to the government, you get paid the hourly rate minus the profit content of that hourly rate. Again, this is something where you have to consult with outside counsel to be sure whether a constructive acceptance has occurred and what your rights are in regard to the reperformance, whether you get an equitable adjustment or simply reperform in accordance with the terms of existing contracts.
Thank you, John.
So now we're going to switch gears and talk about payment issues. So payment issues, actually, this can affect a lot of contractors who may not have had contracts specifically that were affected by the shutdown. You may have not gotten paid on contracts that you were continuing to perform on that were not impacted by the shutdown because the people processing payments, which could be from a different agency, were not working. So let's just talk about what you are entitled to. So one of the things that I think the government has actually done a pretty good job on over the last number of years is increasing the speed at which invoices are processed. So I think that's generally been a good news story for most contractors. But because of the shutdown, obviously the government employees that process payments at a number of agencies were not working. So to the extent that you did not receive payment on invoices, you may be entitled to interest under the Prompt Payment Act clause. So most of your contracts, and again, this is an easy thing to check, should have the Prompt Payment clause, which is shown in this slide, that gives prime contractors the right to be paid interest automatically on invoices that are not paid timely. So this should happen automatically. This is, within the payment system, they do have an algorithm that should calculate this, but most of you, of course, are probably going to be fully aware of which invoices are outstanding that you have not been paid on. And so this is something that you want to monitor to see if you are being paid the interest on that. The Prompt Payment Act does not apply to financing payments. So financing payments are like progress payments on fixed price contracts. So if you submit progress payments, you are not going to receive interest. So this is typically you would get this on your time and materials type invoices. So again, this impacts a lot of different companies, and so you should be seeing it. But basically, the Prompt Payment Act, the interest does begin accruing on the date the payment is due. So generally, the terms are going to be 30 days from the acceptance of a valid invoice, and you would be entitled to, so if you were not paid for 60 days, then you would be entitled to interest, which I believe the interest is based on the Treasury date, until the date you are paid, or until the contractor files a disputes claim under the disputes clause, or in any event no longer than 1 year. So again, minor, this is a minor issue, but I think for many of you, any and all types of relief that you're entitled to, you should seek. So we did want to just point that out. So now, just want to touch real quick on a couple of issues as far as protest claims and appeals. I think the general public, and probably not many of you on this call, but I think the general public thought that anything related to, any of these agencies, nothing happened during the shutdown. But in fact, a lot of organizations and activities were still operating. So the GAO and contract CFOFC were open during the shutdown. So protests should have been filed timely. There's really nothing that should be impacted by the shutdown related to that. Same with filing of claims. There really shouldn't be any issue in terms of your inability to file a claim. If a claim was filed prior to the shutdown and a decision was due during the shutdown, the contractor can continue to wait for the contracting officer, obviously, to render a decision. But there shouldn't be too much of an impact as it relates to that area.
Also, during the shutdown, the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals was open as well. Thus, any appeals that were submitted to the ASBCA should not have been impacted in any way by the shutdown. Likewise, the Civilian Board of Contract Appeals was closed during the shutdown. However, you could still send filings electronically, and all filings must be submitted that way. So in terms of the filing, they certainly could have received that. If an appeal was not received timely, the Civilian Board of Contract Appeals does not have jurisdiction to hear that appeal. However, any appeal that was due during the shutdown but was not filed on time has been waived. So let me just say that again, that any appeal that was due during the shutdown but was not filed on time has been waived. However, a lawsuit filed with the Court of Federal Claims may still be an option. There is no time period within which a deemed denial of a claim must be filed with an appeals board or the Court of Federal Claims. So just wanted to mention that briefly. Again, that's a pretty specific situation where there would have been anyone impacted by the shutdown, but we did just want to mention that.
So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk more about documenting the process, what type of records are needed, what you should do, and what are some next steps if you think that one of these change orders or change clauses or delays that we just talked about might pertain to you and your company.
Yep. So as we mentioned, it's important that you really do understand what clauses are in your contract, what notifications or lack of notifications you received in terms of what your rights are. In any of those situations, though, really the key to this is to have good documentation. And some of that really starts with a timeline. Hopefully someone in your organization, and if you didn't do it contemporaneously, you certainly should go back and do it immediately, is put together documentation on each contract of the timeline of when everything happened. When you first got the stop work notice, the lack of notice, when you attempted to do work and you couldn't because the building was shut, et cetera. So it's important to have that timeline. And then hopefully you already started this process. And again, if you have not, we suggest that you really spend some time focusing on this right away, is really collecting the documentation to support the additional costs and delays that you incurred. Hopefully, if you did do this at the time, when you did have a delay or a stop work notice, hopefully you did set up a separate project number to accumulate the costs. That's the key to this. If you didn't, again, go back now and put together a timeline and put together as much documentation as you have. You should follow the pricing instructions. So again, I want to refer you to FAR Table 15-2. So if you look in section Part 15 of the FAR, that does show the additional information that you should follow. So one thing I did want to point out is, and I think we covered this in an earlier webinar earlier in the year, under the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act, the pricing instructions were actually increased to $2 million. I think before that it was $750,000. So if you have a pricing action or change claim, et cetera, over $2 million, you absolutely have to follow this. But we recommend that you follow this in any situation. Your documentation or the cost that you're entitled to should be consistent with your existing accounting practices by cost elements. So again, quantify the impact of your labor costs, your materials costs. If you are a large business and subject to cost accounting standards, then those are applicable to any reimbursement that you are seeking. And the last bullet, while estimated or actual costs are accepted, and sometimes you can't quantify with actual costs, you do have to use estimates. Of course, actuals are always preferred. Again, the overriding message here is really document. So again, really what you want to provide a full picture to the government is, what's the technical impact? So what was the impact in terms of your ability to perform under the statement of work? What were the accounting, what were the costs that you incurred? Again, in certain circumstances, you're entitled to unabsorbed overhead. And what are your legal rights under the various clauses? State your case in a written format. The entitlement and quantum, and I'm going to ask John just to provide an explanation of what that means. I can give you my summary, but John can probably give you a better description there.
All right, thanks, Susan. Yes, each claim or request for an adjustment to a contract if it's a monetary claim or request for an adjustment in contract price, has two aspects to it. It's the entitlement. There is the entitlement aspect and the quantum aspect. The entitlement aspect is what is the basis that gives you a right to an adjustment. It may be changes clause, where you would have to show under the changes clause, all right, we got this change. What is the change? Whether it's an actual change, a constructive change, or a cardinal change, identify what the change order is, then look at the terms of the changes clause to determine if what you're asking for is authorized under that clause. So that would be your entitlement. There is generally you're looking at, is there a clause in the contract that entitles me to an adjustment under certain circumstances, and those circumstances are present now. Quantum is simply how much. Once you said, all right, here's my entitlement, this is the clause in the contract that entitles me to an adjustment under the circumstances that we're facing, and here is the quantum. These are the increased costs that were caused by the facts that allowed me to assert this claim. In other words, the costs that are caused by a change order. So the quantum, you have to have a change, or not change, but a cause and effect relationship between your entitlement and the amount that you're claiming.
Thank you, John. So just in terms of a couple of practical points, when you're putting this documentation together, I do think the easiest place to start is to look at your original proposal, because what you originally envisioned and proposed for the contract is going to be really the basis for starting out on what happened, what's different, what was the impact from this contract. So you definitely want to look at your proposal when you start and really work from there. Again, you want to have charts and attachments, and I'll give you a list on the next page of some of the specific documents. But one of the things you do want to remember is this is a negotiation. And so I think with most, with any type of negotiation, your best ability is to be prepared and to have a compelling and complete case to make your story, to make your pitch, to negotiate, to minimize the impact that you incurred from the shutdown. If you are looking to submit documentation for a claim or a request for equitable adjustment, again, this is just a basic list of some of the information that you need to put together. Obviously, you want to start with your accounting records, timesheets of employees impacted, if there were travel, meetings. Again, just all of the level of documentation to support your claim that try to attempt to make you whole based on the shutdown that you were impacted through no fault of your own.
Two of those items that are on this list, the meeting documentation correspondence, especially if there's emails or anything with the communication with the government that says from them, hey, we want to keep the same work schedule, or direction on actual production or meeting, the statement of work, those really help to frame the case that you might have on incurred costs. So I just wanted to call those two out real quick.
Yep. So with that, where do we go from here?
So I would say, first thing, the key takeaways is read your contracts, know what clauses are in there, know what you're dealing with. Part of that is to be proactive and understand your timelines if you are requesting a relief. A lot of this too, just like with other items, is take the initiative to seek the relief, be in contact with your CO, make sure you understand what's going on, collect all the documentation and detail it in the timeline. So again, timesheets, correspondence, anything that helps frame your case. This one, you always need to calculate the interest on the prompt payment just to verify that you are eligible to receive that. And then lastly, if you have any questions, make sure to talk to your legal or accounting advisors, just like us. We're more than happy to answer any questions, and a lot of times they have the guidance to help you move forward.
So with that, hopefully the information that we've provided has been helpful to you that are obviously a lot of companies are feeling the pain from this unfortunate shutdown. I know we all are holding our breath and hoping that that does not happen again. As Eric said, if you have specific questions or need help, we would be happy to help you. I'm sorry we did not have time for questions today. It was just a lot of information we wanted to get through, but again, we're happy to assist you on a one-on-one basis. You will be getting a follow-up email with access to these slides, so they will be made available to you.
And on that note, that is the end of the webinar today. We thank you all for joining and hope you all have a great day.